Voilà, nous avons décidé de faire notre présentation en anglais. We have decided to make this part to present it in English, so as to allow almost everybody to follow, to participate. And I have put an Italian and I believe a French version of my text on the chat. So people who want to read it in Italian or in French can go to the chat and select or download the files I have sent. Okay. Wish you all welcome this morning for conferences on education. With Karel de Vos, my teammate at this divan, I worked for many years in Jongerencentrum Siddar, a center within the framework of Youth Aid in Belgium. He was its director for 40 years. A lawyer by training, he undertook in recent years study in social pedagogy at the University of Ghent, which culminated in a thesis on the pre-structuring of care, the socio-pedagogical perspective on the evolution of the relationship between educators and young people in care. In this institution, guided by concept of psychothérapie et pédagogie institutionnelle, we focused on the relationships developing between the youngsters, their families, their worlds, and the center. We thus conducted a weekly intervision seminar for years, taking up what Karel had called a situation. One of them was invited to bring forward in the group. The term situation was precisely intended to avoid objectifying case discussions or to emphasize the need to examine the situation a case developed in. Particularly interesting were those moments of questioning, images conveyed in the dominant pedagogies. Now, Karel has devised a similar method of collective examination, starting from the common vision of a feature film to initiate discussions in relation to the own work of youth workers, a method that he will no doubt tell us about. In this Ascension Week, I will speak about the French verb élever, to elevate or to raise, and about the gap between the French words élévation, raising understood as elevation, and élevage, raising as breeding, in relation with the work of the many educators involved. Several terms, nouns, or verbs, all figuratively indeed, say how the child of man must access adult life, or how to conceive the task imposed on adults to take care of it. That is to say, verbs like to raise, to educate, to teach, to form, to learn, to discipline, and nouns, education, teaching, training. Among them, élever, the transitive or pronominal verb to raise oneself, derived from the Latin elevare, prefixed e, meaning out and upwards, and the verb levare, lifting up. Let me examine shortly the existential questions attached to elevation and the various tensions that participate in education, a drama that can turn into a tragedy. For Ludwig Binswanger, elevation evokes altitude and latitude, height and breadth, and some questions about Dasein, being there. As we can read in his writings, Dream and Existence, and on the anthropological meaning of Verstiegenheit. This German word is hard to translate in any other language. The best circumscription is to have climbed, steigen, beyond, versteigen, limits, beyond limits, and getting stuck there, Versteigenheit. The term extravagance is usable here, despite the fact that it's not adequate to the German word. Let me quote this 1963 English translation by Harvard professor John Needleman, who used the term extravagance for its Latin roots, extra, beyond, and vagari, wandering, taken together meaning wandering beyond a limit. This text says, it's a Ludwig Binswanger text. Human existence projects itself in breadth and in height. It not only strides forward, but also mounts upward. In both respects, therefore, it is possible for human existence to go too far. To become extravagant. If now we are to understand the anthropological meaning of extravagance, we must seek what it is that makes possible the change from existential rising into a mode of existence that is extravagant. Anthropology can never limit its investigation to only one existential direction, but rather, being anthropological, must always have before it the total structure of human beings. The basis, therefore, of this change or conversion from existential rising into extravagance will, from the start, be viewed of not merely as upward movement, but will be understood as part of the koinonia or community of other basic potentialities of human existence. As I have attempted to show elsewhere, extravagance is, in fact, rooted in certain disharmony in the relation between rising upwards and striding forth. If we call such a relation anthropologically proportionate when it is successful, then we must speak of extravagance as a form of anthropological disproportion, as a failure of the relationship between height and breadth in the anthropological sense. The rising upward of human being is not to be understood within the context of its being in the world and its corresponding spatialization and temporalization. It is rather to be understood in the context of its being beyond the world, in the sense of the at-homeness and eternalness of love, in which there exists no above and below, no near and far, no sooner and later. If, nevertheless, human existence as a finite being still remains consigned to hate and breath, it can go too far only where it has broken out of the home and eternity of love and is completely contained in space and time between brackets. Sondi's fate analysis, reconsidering the spectral dimension of health and illness, stated that it's up to the person to choose his or her path between destiny constraint and destiny freedom. Jacques Schotte's anthropopsychiatry is a deepening and structural development of it. I have already presented to you how Schotte introduced the prefix anthropo to sharpen the meaning of the other prefix, psyche, considered too general for man, for it was applied since Aristotle to any living being, zoon, without capturing the part of existence as making a life history, bios. Schotte answered the call of Arthur Kronfeld, who, in his book, The Foundations of Psychiatric Knowledge, criticized psychiatry for lacking an ontological foundation. Autologic meaning embedded autos in the living and rethinking contact with the clinic itself, without borrowings from outside this field. Ludwig Binswanger again said that in clinical psychiatry, an amalgam of heterogeneous sciences foreign to the human psychiatric fact itself was flourishing. Let me quote him again, proposing in the introduction to his Heraclitean apprehension of man for psychiatry, proposing a totally new task, namely to see and describe in their purely anthropological structure the forms of human being, which it describes clinically as diseases of the mind. This task came to her, to psychiatry, from having understood the inadequacy of the morally contemptuous language with which she still all too often describes the modifications, the so-called lower values of forms of human being. Anthropopsychiatry thus offers an account of the pulsional and structural level in thinking of human development, in the present context focused on the period from birth to the dawn of adult life, as well as on the roles taken or to be taken by the entourage of the little ones that need a long time to grow and develop in the bosom of the community before occupying a place called adult. Should we then propose an anthropopedagogy to specify a pedagogy that concerns the human child? Etymologically, no, since the Greek root of the first syllable of pedagogy, ped, pais, the Greek word pais, originally refers to man, either in relation to his descent, child of, to his age, or to his social condition. But to speak of anthropopedagogy would serve here to give an anthropic sense based on a pulsional and existential approach that sets the problem of the so-called pedagogy in a perspective proper to human existence. That is to say, other than as an evolved zoological variety of mammals, with repercussions on any thought that seeks to approach the proper destiny of man, of each man in person and of humanity as a whole, of each child in person and of childhood in general. The child grows naturally and by necessity in a protected environment, but immediately too, the little person emerges already in the process of conquering a place for himself or herself in the world, against and with the other, experiencing constraints and potentials, discovering oneself both opaque and objectifiable. For this childhood, starting as infants, that is, not yet speaking, then subjected to the latency of its sexuality, undergoing the pubertal thrust and the question of its identity in adolescence with a view to an adulthood that is both feared and desired. For this childhood, education is to be conceived as a means of making it possible to walk this track full of successive separations, traps and obstacles, and also of blossomings for sure, as much for the young persons as for those who have to look after them. While Freud developed the Oedipal relationship of the child toward the parents, Georges Devereux in 1953 introduced the concept of Leos complex to account for equivalent feelings on the part of the father for his son. To illustrate, let's take the myth of Icare that focuses on the, let's say, extravaganza of the boy who, on wings made for him by his father Dédale, so that they could together escape from the labyrinth Dédale himself had built, flies so high despite his father's warning that the sun melts, flies so high that the sun melts the wax that held the feathers of to the frame, precipitating his fatal fall into the Aegean Sea. The focus in this myth is often not so much on Dédale, nor on the father-son relationship, which nevertheless emerges reconsidering the father's story, who was a creative artist, an architect, and an inventor of prodigious instruments. When this man of genius was confronted in Athens with his nephew Perdix, who had become his pupil and who showed a nascent talent equal to that of the master, if not capable of surpassing it, Dédale threw him down from the Acropolis. Thereupon Pallas Athena turned the young Perdix into a partridge, allowing him to save in his fall his life in a flight, preventing the fatal outcome of the attempted jealous murder by his teacher and pedagogue. In Crete, an analogous but reversed scene occurs, where it is the father who gives wings to his son in order to, like himself, escape imprisonment in the labyrinth he had built himself. But is it not also this Dédale, himself extravagant, who leads the young man entrusted to him, voluntarily or not, toward the fall? No goddess here to rescue the unfortunate boy. With the invention of pedagogy as a set of methods, education is understood as the application of techniques and practices designed to achieve goals, which often aim at disciplining and making people fit to function in a concrete society, to the detriment of the question of what is human and alienating human existence, human living together. Schotte, Jacques Schotte, warned us, saying that it is still said that what counts is practice. Yes, the problem is that practice never goes ahead, whether we like it or not, consciously or unconsciously, without already having a theory. And we have to reflect on this from time to time. As a beautiful Germanic word, sich besinnen, says, meaning to return to the meaning of what we are doing, of what we are really doing. Raising children could thus be thought of in terms of an encounter between young and older existence, who may or may not acknowledge, respect, or love each other. What will become of the child as an existent in progress, driven by his or her own pulsions, which can get out of hand, but also by the possibility and the task, also pulsional, of making choices and of assuming more and more the problem of an existence in abyss. Adolescence is one of the crossroads where such a confrontation will take place. The sufferings that are specific to it, such as attested by school failures, crises, suicides, incipient psychosis, the great questions of personal and sexual identity, show it, often by surprise. Adults, often oblivious to their own development, then risk missing the importance of this dimension of encounter, that is, of interested openness to the other, through distrust, arrogance, or ignorance, often under the disguise of principles and rationalizations of some pedagogical principles. What psychoanalysis and Dasein's analysis and some pedagogies as well shed light on is the counter-transferential aspect with disastrous consequences, as described by Ferenczi as early as in 1932, or the failure of the existential encounter according to Ludwig Binswanger, or the profound tensions and questions between autonomy and discipline in education. Between the child and the adult in relationship, a relationship is woven that is mixed with love and hate, respect and rivalry, recognition and misunderstanding, at the risk of obliterating the existential dimension and its elusive ground. Let me end with one of the most famous Freudian quotes, the one referring to education, healing, and government, from Analysis Terminable and Interminable. It almost looks as if analysis were the third of those impossible professions in which one can be sure only of unsatisfying results. The other two, as has long been agreed, are the bringing up of children and the government of nations, said Freud. The same quote, slightly rephrased, appeared before in Freud's preface to August Eichhorn's 1925 book, Verwahrloste Jugend. This recalled me the 1999 article of French Mireille Sifali, questioning and discussing that same quote in Impossible Job, an Inexhaustible Joke. It can be said, quoting her, it can be said that there is no definitive science of government, education, or care. We will never reach the end. There is certainly knowledge built either by the clinic or in the laboratory through experimentation, but the living encounter between people around, healing, education, and living together can never be reduced to it. On the other hand, in order to think about our actions, we need to build a knowledge of the living and the singular that takes into account uncertainty, chance, and complexity. Referring to the clinic as a perspective for thinking about these professions, therefore requires us to assume the impossible as a precious commodity, so as not to freeze ourselves in a state of theory that would take itself for a timeless truth. Concluding her contribution with, let us return to the Freudian quip of assured failure. If insufficient success were to find its example, education would indeed provide it. For some, this is its tragedy. For others, it is a question of human freedom. Those who want to forge another to their measure according to an established plan and goals set there for his good or her good, finds one day that this other thwarts their plan, transforms it, and resurfaces where they had not foreseen it. The educational measures that they had believed to be effective turning into their opposite. And if, by chance, their mastery succeeds, if their previous wishes are obeyed and their path is followed, there comes a moment when the surface cracks and a symptom appears. A misfortune occurs when the project is too faithfully followed. The living being is objectified, killed in its singularity, prevented from accessing its position of inalienable subject. Life takes its revenge, laughing at the best intentions as well as the worst. So, what would be the standard by which success or failure could be judged? Some have argued that the success of an education lies precisely in the fact that it fails. The person who is the object of it thwarts the project forged for him or her and finds himself or herself emerging as a subject in difference and in separation. And vice versa, an education that is successful in the eyes of the one who provides it turns out to be a failure in the eyes of the one who undergoes it. If education is the exemplary place of power and might, its insufficient success would also attest to the fact that this power is nonetheless limited. The human being escapes predetermination. It resists normative attempts as well as the totalizing enterprise. Let me add to end now that this might not just be the case for education alone. Thank you.